All right, I am here to talk to you about evolution, both micro and macro evolution. And before we do that, I want to kind of give you the broad perspective of what evolution is. And in order to do that, we want to appreciate the fact that the only thing that we know for certain is that things change. And in the world of biology, this change that we see over time is called evolution. So evolution is the genetic change within a population. Recall from the very first lecture of the semester, we know that individuals don't evolve, but populations do. So evolution is the genetic change that we see within a population over a very long period of time. And traditionally what we see with evolution is that these genetic changes can be explained by adaptation to their environment, to the organism's environment. And in most cases, evolution happens as a means to better adapt or be better suited to your environment. So this would not be a good example of evolution because that little critter on the right, although is in the same species as the one on the left, which is the canine lupus, which is the basically the origin of all the dog species. But it would be hard to imagine a world in which that cute little critter on the right is more adapted to the environment, unless of course that environment is the inside of a purse or something. So this is really all about is looking at biodiversity. So what exactly is biodiversity? Well, biodiversity is essentially all the different sorts of critters that you can find, right? All of that. So we would call this called the phylogenetic tree of life. And you see we have all three of our domains, the bacterial domain, the archaeans, and the eukaryotes. Here we are, the animals, we're just a little very small sliver of this whole picture. So as you can see on this tree of life, there's incredible diversity within each of these domains. And again, we are just a tiny branch. We, being animals, we are just a tiny branch of the eukaryotic domain, right? One tiny little branch of the tree. And the reason why we draw these structures like this is because we try to kind of group things based on similarity and similar shared ancestry, I guess you could say. And so if you look at this phylogenetic tree of life right here, if we were to put a circle here, that would be the shared common ancestor. So all of the groups that you see on that slide, that what looks like a fan, all of those groups evolved from one common ancestor. And of course we have to go way, way back to do that. So one of the things when you study evolution, we're trying to do is try to figure out how to put things together, right? So one of the things we're concerned with is whether or not something is related to something else. So sometimes it seems like it might be fairly easy just based on what you see to determine if something is related, but sometimes it's not quite that simple. So how do we compare and contrast in reference to relatedness? Well, first thing we can do is we can look at these different critters, and by looking at their anatomy or looking at them phenotypically, what we see, the phenotypic similarities, that experience or that exercise of just observing would be called morphologic similarities. So if something shares an anatomical feature, or they share different phenotypic similarities, we would say that they're morphologically similar. Another option is genetic similarities. And in order to look at a genetic similarity, it means they have to have similar genotypes. So think about how you are related, you look similar to your people in your family. It's because you have genotypic similarities with people you're related to. Doesn't mean you have to look exactly like them, but you have genotypic similarities. So if we were to take, let's say you have 3 children in your family and your neighbors have 4 children and the people on the other side have another 3 or 4 children, you lined everybody up in a pile, chances are you're going to look more similar to your siblings because of your genetic similarities, because you you share similar genotypes. Not saying that you have shared the exact genotype, obviously that's not the case at all, but you share some genotypic similarities. And so that would be fairly easy in most cases for someone to determine that you would be related to your brother and sister versus your neighbor or the person on the other side. All right, so again, there's lots of ways to sort of do this. This structure is called a cladogram, and it's just an opportunity to try to put things in groups and see what they share in common. So in this particular one, we see along the organisms that we're looking at, we have some insects, some fish, some amphibians, some birds, some prosimians, and humans, right? The common ancestor here, what all of these critters have in common is they all stem from a common ancestor that had a characteristic, which was that they developed from a blastula, right? And then that's all we share in common. We humans share in common with the insects. So then we go up a little bit. Now everything above this line, these critters all have a vertebra or vertebrae. And then we go up here, we have the tetrapods, and then we go up here, the birds, the prosimians, and the humans all share a common ancestor that began with an amniotic egg. And then you see hair, which is a common characteristics of the prosimians and us, and then we're the only ones on this particular picture that are bipedal, meaning we stand on two legs. So it's just an exercise of organization, right? That's basically it. So traditionally what we'll do here is if you're trying to figure out what the common ancestor based on a cladogram, right? If I were to say, identify the common ancestor of the amphibians, the primates, the rabbits, rodents, crocodiles, and birds, you would look at the cladogram and you would look where all of those share a point on the cladogram. So you'd put a circle right there. That would be the common ancestor for those guys. And again, common ancestors have shared characteristics. There's a lot of difference between these critters, but they do share a common ancestor. You've got to kind of go way back to find it, but you can find it. All right, so again, just for us to sort of appreciate, I'm going to say it many times throughout this, but evolution happens at the population level of organization. Again, these evolutionary trees are just ways or means of illustrating ancestry and relatedness. An evolutionary tree is not the same thing as a family tree. When we have ancestors, they are ancestors of a group would be represented by a dot, and that dot is actually called a node. Usually the ancestors are not alive anymore. And again, the opportunity for this, or the utility of this exercise, is to map relatedness, explain relatedness and shared characteristics. All right, so let's see what else we can learn about an evolutionary tree. I guess that's it for now. Okay, so what we want to do is I want to kind of, again, tell you what evolution is. Evolution, of course, happens in a population, not an individual. The fancy way of thinking about evolution is it's a change in allele frequency over time. Remember that word allele? An allele frequency. So it's most of the times when we have a change in allele frequency over time, that's usually due to like a mutation. So some kind of a mutation that proved to be advantageous, we would see more and more of those alleles in populations over time. So the answer, does evolution occur in an individual? Hopefully by now you're saying no, it occurs at the population. And so what exactly is a population? So a population is just a group of critters that can reproduce with one another. That's the important thing. Populations evolve, individual organisms do not. Populations evolve when their allele frequency changes in the population, right? That's basically it. It's the population is the smallest unit that can evolve. Oops, my animations are off. Darn it. So let me go back here. We'll go back. So this picture, oh yeah, right, my animations aren't off. Sorry, I might just totally brain farted. So this is a picture of a population, in this case of wolves, right? They're all the same species, they're a population. The reason why they are considered a population is because they can all reproduce with one another. Well, they can't all reproduce with one another, but the members of the male and female members can reproduce with one another. All right, so we're talking a lot about allele frequency and all of that. And so when we talk about evolution, there's lots of discussion around a gene pool. So all a gene pool is it is the number of all, it consists of all the genes carried by all the individuals in that said population. And it helps when discussing evolution to have some parameters that define your population, right? Because it would be very difficult if you were just to say like all the gene pool on the entire planet Earth, that all of the humans contribute. That would be a huge undertaking. So instead we kind of think of it in a little bit more of with a defined parameter. So allele frequency is the composition of the alleles, given alleles in a population. And sometimes this is, again, what we're trying to kind of think about here is how do you know what's related to something else? And sometimes that can be kind of difficult, right? So what we know is that the variations in the gene pool and again, those are all the genes carried by that population, by those individuals, in that population. And the variations in the gene pool results from mutations, like we just said, which is completely random and spontaneous. And of course, sexual reproduction, right? We talked about that. That's one of the reasons why we have an increase in genetic variability, is because we have crossing over, we have independent assortment, random fertilization, etc. And the other thing that we want to think about a little bit is natural selection, because natural selection is going to affect the gene pool also over a period of time. So we are going to think about this natural selection a little bit. We're going to try to remember that we have a guy that really laid this whole situation out for us, and his name was Charles Darwin, right? Charles Darwin was the guy who gets the credit for really kind of laying out in a very logical way the evidence for evolution. All right, so remember him. He's the guy, we talked about him in the first day of class. He's the guy that wrote this book, which is called The Origin of Species, and he lived in the 1800s, and he traveled around, and he checked out a bunch of stuff. He drew a lot of pictures, and he started to try to make some sense out of why, for example, this finch looked different than this finch. What he tried to make an attempt to kind of explain some of the diversity that he was seeing. And he wrote about it in this book. So he really was the first one to in a mechanistic sort of way explain how species could evolve. And his mechanism of evolution was natural selection. So let's kind of dive into this a little bit. So in that book, Origin of Species, Darwin made two very important points. First, he made the point that modern species have descended from common ancestors. That's essentially evolution. And the second, and probably more important point, was natural selection is the mechanism for or of evolution. And he arrived at that idea by making a lot of observations and drawing some conclusions. So we're going to kind of look at his observations and his conclusions, starting with his observations. All right, so he laid it all out. Once he kind of wrapped this whole deal up, laid it all out in his book. It was pretty straightforward, based on simple observations and what appeared to be obvious conclusions, starting with observation number 1. So first thing he noted was that populations exhibit great variation. Of course, we know that. Why do populations exhibit great variation? Well, there's, he didn't know all about this meiosis business at the time, but we know it now. We know about sexual reproduction. We know about meiosis. We know about crossing over. We know about independent assortment. We know about mutations. So that was the first thing he noticed. So for example, here's a little population of ladybugs. You see some dark red ones, some orange ones, some yellow ones. They're all ladybugs, but they all look a little bit different. That's a variation. So you see that across all sorts of different populations. All right, so that was his first observation. Observation number 2 was overpopulation. Given the opportunity, more babies are going to be born than could ever possibly survive. Critters overpopulate. He observed this all over the place. So that's an observation. So we know that there's a lot of variation. We know that critters tend towards overpopulation. And the third observation, of course, bunnies are the perfect example of overpopulation. The third example was that there was a limited number of resources. And when you have overpopulation and limited resources, that's going to lead to competition. All right, so those were his 3 basic observations. So the competition thing factors in. So we're going to circle back around for that. So we've got populations exhibiting great variation, overpopulation, and limited resources. So based on his observations that we just outlined, he inferred that 1, some critters will be more likely to survive due to inherited traits that make them more adapted to their environment, that make them better suited for survival. And those that have those traits that make them better suited for survival, or you could say give them the survival advantage, those critters that have the survival advantage will produce more offspring. And this is what we refer to as fitness, right? So this is logical stuff, right? If, for example, let's go back to these guys for a minute. Check these guys standing back here watching this poor one get eaten, right? Let's say they have longer legs, they run faster, whatever. They all have that trait. This one, not so much, right? So that one didn't do quite as well, right? So, this poor animal's genes are not getting to go into the gene pool, right? That one's not going to produce more offspring. However, all those ones that are still alive, those ones have the potential. That's what we call fitness, Darwinian fitness, which is kind of seems a little bit messed up to me, but it's the way that it is in context of evolution, that the most fit organisms, and I'm using fit in quotations there, the most fit organisms are favored by natural selection. And all in respect to Darwinian fitness, all that really matters is the contribution that an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation. It's measured simply in terms of number of healthy offspring produced. So whatever confers that survival advantage, those are the sorts of things that are passed on, whether it's the ability to run very fast, to be more camouflaged, to have greater strength, all of those things that do allow for this survival advantage, those genes are passed on. If you can't run fast, chances are you're going to get eaten. If you stand out against your environment, chances are you're going to get eaten. So your genes are out, and the genes that allow them to be hidden in their environment are going to be passed on. That's what we call Darwinian fitness. So all of that put together, after all this time and all those observations and those inferences that we just said, he came up with his theory of natural selection. And the basic idea of this was those who have a certain genetic trait that increases their chance, their chance of having offspring, they're going to pass those genes on. And groups of organisms will undergo genetic changes over time due to natural selection, right? So just think about that for a second. So there's something that confers this survival advantage. Some of the critters are killed. The ones that are alive, they reproduce. Those genes are still in the gene pool, right? So now the gene pool is going to have a higher concentration of those genes that conferred that survival advantage, right? And then they're going to reproduce, and they're going to pass those genes on, and they're going to pass those genes on. So over time, we can actually see that groups of organisms, or we could say populations, undergo genetic changes due to this natural selection, right? Oftentimes this is referred to as survival of the fittest. I think we talked about that in our lab. And if this goes on long enough, over a very long period of time, this can actually create a new species from an existing species. Think back to the very second slide I showed you with that big cladogram with all the biodiversity. Everything on there, bacterial, Archaean, eukaryota, all those domains, everything in those domains all shared a common ancestor. So obviously, over time, we get enough change that we can't reproduce with one another, right? That's kind of the line in the sand. If you can't reproduce with one another, you are not in this, you're no longer the same species. You're no longer the same population. All right, so to wrap this up, the conclusions drawn by this theory of natural selection, or conclusions drawn by Darwin, I guess, one, the observation was that traits of an organism are likely to be passed on from generation to generation, and that conclusion was simply evolution. Because traits are passed from one generation to the next, and because certain members are more likely to survive and reproduce, a population will change over time, allowing it to be better suited to its environment. That's the big thing, but that's why we see changes. Changes are supposed to make you more adapted to the environment, not less adapted to the environment. So a couple things to remember, important points. Individuals do not evolve. Natural selection does act on individuals, but only population evolves. And natural selection only works on heritable traits. And those are traits that are genetically coded for, right? If it's not genetically coded for, you can't pass it on. So that's kind of a no-brainer. And another thing I think that's sort of important to kind of think about, because it can get this is sort of an interesting topic and it can make you think about a lot of stuff. But one thing we do know, I think, is that evolution doesn't have an end goal, right? It's not a goal-oriented event, right? It occurs in response to local environmental conditions, not in a predictive way for future ones. It's not like we can see we know what's coming, so we're adapting to it before it gets here. We're adapting to changes as they occur in the environment. Okay, so that's a big topic. Evolution is big, and so when we can actually see evolution over, evidence of evolution in populations, we call that macroevolution. It's big. But macroevolution is driven by these small changes, and those small changes are referred to as microevolution. And that's really what's happening from generation to generation. So this is evolution occurring on the smallest scale possible. So if you look at the slide here, you see we've got this population of bunnies. We have 7 gray ones and 2 brown ones, right? So that when you see something like this, you think, well, maybe it's advantageous to be gray in this particular population. So then if we see, so this is the blue lines are the gray bunnies, and the red lines are the brown bunnies. In our next generation, we are seeing a little change. We have now 3 brown bunnies, 6 blue bunnies. This isn't very noticeable. But when we go another generation, now we're almost half and half. And we see that something is happening here, right? Something is happening that's making the brown bunny population increase, or the brown bunnies increase in this population. So these genes, the allele frequency for the coat color is changing. So if we saw, if you could kind of think about, well, if whatever is going on stays, the next generation you would see, another brown bunny, another brown bunny, and soon enough, we're going to have all brown bunnies, right? That's microevolution. And it's, again, the evidence of this is got to be taken over many generations. And it's the gradual adaptation to the local environment. So there's some mechanisms of evolution, and this is what we did in our lab a few weeks ago. So the first one I want to mention is something called genetic drift. So genetic drift is random and it's kind of bizarre. And it's really mostly significant with small populations, right? So with a small gene pool. And one example of genetic drift is something called sorry, I was spacing out. I thought it would come up next. It's right here. Yeah, here we go. It's called the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. They're both on here. So these are examples of genetic drift. So again, mostly significant with relatively small populations. So basically, with the bottleneck effect, we've got some population of critters, and some kind of random event happens. And then what that's going to do is it's going to change the gene pool due to a reduction in population size. So let's say we've got, some lions. There's a pride of lions, and for whatever reason, let's say there's just 6 of them. And for whatever reason, 4 of them go on a hunt somewhere, and 2 of them stay back. And those that left on a hunt fell into a volcano. Probably not likely, but that's all I can come up with at the moment. So they fall into the volcano and they all die. And the ones that stayed home are alive still, obviously. And more importantly, they are responsible for repopulating the gene pool. So it was a random event, right? It's not like the lions that were very fast and strong lived and the other ones died. It was just random. That's what I mean by random and bizarre. And again, the evidence of that really is, it's evidenced in a small population. And it's a change in the gene pool due to a usually sudden and random reduction in population size. Excuse me. Another example is the founder effect. And the founder effect essentially is if you have a small group from a population leaving the group and they go to a new place and they get stuck there. And they're now responsible for founding a new gene pool. That would be an example of the founder effect. Let me go back to gene flow for a second. So gene flow is looking at immigration, meaning new people coming into a population, or immigration with an E, existing people leaving the population. And when you add new people to the population, obviously they're going to pool their genes into the gene pool, or if you take some people away, they're going to subtract their genes from the gene pool. So that is going to make those separate populations ultimately more genetically similar. So the ones that leave, they're going to add their genes into the pool, and the ones that stay are going to add their genes in, and over time, those two groups, if you give it enough time, will be more similar than they would be if someone didn't come or leave, if that makes sense. All right, we talked about that one. Another example is sexual selection. And basically, if the male and the female look different, then it's most likely, if you see in nature an example where the male and the female look different from one another, then likely sexual selection is at play. And essentially, certain members or individuals are more likely to attract mates based on how they look, and therefore produce more offspring. So that's selecting your mate based on some kind of desirable trait that they possess. So here we have an example. This is very evident in the bird world. The male birds, like in this case, the male bird is so much more beautiful than the female. She doesn't need to be beautiful. She gets to make the selection, right? So that's it's pretty obvious in the bird world. The one that sings the best is usually the male. The one that has the prettiest flowers is usually the male. Now we add humans to this whole situation, and that makes everything very bizarre in many cases. So everything that we've talked about so far, the selective pressure has been placed on the population or populations by the environment. Something that's happened in the environment. So with artificial selection, humans are responsible for applying the selective pressure. And what that really means is humans basically have the ability to decide what traits are desirable and alter the gene pool accordingly. So dogs are a super good example of this, right? All dogs share a common ancestor, which is the gray wolf. We saw a picture of that on the second slide, but they all look very different. And that's because humans have gotten involved, right? I mean, we'd have dogs, different sorts of dogs anyway, but probably not nearly as many types of dogs as we have. And so humans get involved and they say, oh, you know, I want one that's big and strong and is a good swimmer and, you know, whatever that one does. I want one that hunts, whatever. I want one that has pointy ears, a beard, and is kind of short. I want one with really long ears, whatever, right? We do this. We decide what we want and we breed for it. And that would not likely have happened on its own, right? And you can kind of see if something doesn't look like it would give it a genetic advantage. I don't know what the environmental advantage would be to that cute little critter. Again, other than the fact that, you know, if you were trying to evolve to live in a purse, that's great, but that would not have happened on its own. However, humans do all sorts of strange things. All right, so macroevolution is big, microevolution is small. Microevolution drives macroevolution. Macroevolution are these major changes in the history of life, which result basically in the origin of new species. Also, we see during the evolutionary history, we see mass extinctions. Those, of course, put a lot of pressure and do big changes to the gene pool. We see the diversification of new life forms, right? So we've got this incredible diversity on Earth that's basically representative of a very long history of evolution, because we all have a shared common ancestor. Remember, we did that timeline. It was very informative because we see that, you know, we went back 4.6 billion years ago and, you know, there wasn't a whole lot going on, right? And most of the bulk of what's in terms of biodiversity has happened in the relatively recent past in reference to the time of evidence that we have for actual life on Earth. So I want to talk a little bit about this concept of speciation. Before we do, and that's the development of a new species from a previous species, or splitting off, I guess, into two different species. So the word species is derived from a Latin word which means appearance. So sometimes, remember we started the lecture about that in the beginning, sometimes we can look at things and say, oh yeah, this is most likely related to this based on its appearance. But sometimes it's hard to tell. Oftentimes it's hard to tell. For example, all these dogs, they're all the same species, which means they all have the ability to reproduce with one another if they wanted to. Well, the males and the females. Of course, you understand that. But look here, we've got these birds. This is the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark. They almost look exactly the same, but they're actually two different species, which means they cannot naturally interbreed. So how did that happen, right? How does it happen that we get this, how obviously they started off as the same species, but they've changed. So how does that happen? And it happens by different, what we refer to as forms of reproductive isolation, and it takes a while. So we've got these reproductive barriers that maintain species. And remember, we said that a species can be defined as a group of individuals that are able to interbreed with one another. So what keeps the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark from breeding with one another? Well, there's some sort of reproductive barrier. Some of these are fairly obvious and some of them not so much, but we're going to run through 6 types of reproductive barriers, right? And the reproductive barriers, again, means that it keeps those two from interbreeding. So the first is called behavioral isolation, which essentially means that some behavior deters reproduction. Members of a species oftentimes identify one another through specific rituals, and those rituals are what sort of, give the clue that that's what's being looked for here is reproduction. And so if you don't recognize the ritual or you don't get the clue, you're not going to reproduce. So that's one. Mating time difference. That's pretty obvious, right? Sometimes they refer to this as temporal isolation. It's a time issue. One population likes to mate in the morning, the other one at night. They're not going to probably reproduce with one another. That's a barrier. The third is habitat isolation. This is a big one. So habitat isolation, or sometimes it's referred to as ecological isolation. If they live in different places, different habitats or different ecological niches, then they are not going to ever meet, likely. One lives in a tree and the other one lives on the grass. Chances of them meeting up, not so good. That's a reproductive barrier. 4, mechanical isolation. Simply, parts don't fit, right? If their anatomies are incompatible, there's very little chance of any success in that respect. So that is definitely a reproductive barrier. Gametic incompatibility. So this is like the sperm and the egg, they just can't combine. The sperm doesn't like the egg, or the egg doesn't like the sperm, or there's some kind of sperm-egg issues where they can't fertilize each other. So no fertilization means no reproduction. They try, right? Parts might work, but the egg and the sperm do not allow for fertilization. And then our last one here is hybrid weakness. So when two species mate and get fertilization, so in this case, the two species can mate, you can get fertilization, but the zygote either dies or is infertile. That's called hybrid weakness. A classic example of this is the mating of a horse and a donkey, which gives you a mule, and mules are infertile. So that's the story there. So those are 6 forms of reproductive isolation. And again, that keeps the species from interbreeding, which ultimately over time will isolate these species to such a degree that they are no longer able to breed with one another. So that's how we get a new species, right? You start with an original species, but you've got enough reproductive barriers put in place that ultimately, far enough down the line, those two species are going to become reproductively isolated, and that's called speciation. So some sort of event has to separate the population, and it can be any number of things or a combination. Usually it's going to be geographic isolation, right? They're not around one another. But time, space, all sorts of things can do it. So ultimately those populations will diverge along their own evolutionary path, and they will get far enough along that path that they would not be able to kind of backtrack and reproduce with one another. This is an example of that happening. These guys are salamanders that all started from up here, and they were separated. So they started migrating down, this group, and they were separated. This is the top of California. They were separated, excuse me, by the Sierra Nevada mountain range. So they split, fork in the road. This group went this way, this group went this way. They adapted to their environment. You see they look a little bit different. They look a little bit different, right? These each are a new species of salamander, right? When we get all the way down here, the ones that went left, I'm very interested to see what their environment was all about. Look at how crazy the colors, right? They changed a lot. When they got all the way down here to Southern California, now we've got these guys and these guys. Even though they shared a common ancestor, they cannot reproduce with one another. That's called speciation. We have new species in this case. So, excuse me, we can look all kinds of places for evidence. We can look at the fossil record. The more primitive organisms are deeper in the fossil layers. We saw this before. The deeper the layer, the older the piece of rock is. So fossils have been found that can be analyzed for critters that no longer exist. They date the layer of rock in which they're found, so they kind of get like frozen in that layer of time. You know, they can confirm this by looking at half-lives and radioactive isotopes. You don't need to remember that, but it's interesting. Another way we can sort of look for evidence of speciation is by looking at the structures. Remember, we talked about this in the lab. We have homologous structures and we have analogous structures. Homologous structures usually indicate relatedness. Analogous structures are basically they are giving us an idea that there's something about that structure that makes them more adapted to their environment, but they're not necessarily the same species, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We can look at genetic similarities. The more closely related the organisms, the more genetically similar they are. We have all sorts of technology to be able to do this. We know all kinds of stuff about DNA that we didn't know. We've sequenced all sorts of organisms, and we can compare their genetics to one another. This DNA sequencing is going to also allow us probably to determine some evolutionary relationships as well. So that, I believe, is our discussion on evolution, macro and microevolution. So I will post some questions for you to complete, and that will conclude this part of your class, the course for this topic. I will see you guys in class soon.